comma, based on a very different method, comma, and also a very different underlying structure, full stop. It's not abstract labor that's being extracted and monetized, full stop. Rather, comma, it's all sorts of resources which are then used in production, or they are used in getting certain outcomes which are then monetized by finance, full stop. This is as homogeneous. Well, this is not homogeneous, comma, in part because I don't think that there is any exchange between the individual bits and pieces, comma, which ultimately was also not the case when it came to labor, full stop. The labor of a skilled worker was not equal to the labor of just some amateur, full stop. So I'm not sure it actually worked in that case either, but there was some kind of a pool, there was some kind of ability to substitute one for another, full stop. And the other element, which is very important, dash the alienation from the means of production, dash that too does not seem to be present, full stop, but there are other ways in which pressure is exercised, dash, and those have to do with the presence of the state and the fact that the state, but also perhaps financial institutions and others, impose certain imperatives on us which are not to be avoided, full stop. So if you think about nudging or behavioral economics or anything else sanctioned by the state, comma, the kind of imperatives that are built into them to some extent are very much like the imperatives that stem from us having to earn a living in the marketplace and thus having to sell our labor, full stop, new paragraph. In a sense, comma, what you can argue is happening is that we are selling off our future, full stop. That what is being traded in these markets, it's not necessarily human experience, comma, as Zubov claims, full stop. Rather, comma, it's our future, full stop. But this too seems to be a very ambiguous kind of argument, which I would need to define much better, because I can actually argue that what's being sold in this markets is some kind of pacification, comma, it's some kind of security, dash, it's basically capitalists maybe trading in risk, full stop. But again, here, I think I tend to confuse the almost non-existing markets in outcomes, dash, this is what Zubov is talking about, dash, and to some extent, the use of our data as just inputs into production, full stop. So, new paragraph, I might need to actually draw that distinction very sharply, dash, show that, you know, when there is this accumulation through, well, appropriation might not be the right word, but accumulation through something, dash, that it either provides security, dash, thus ensuring not the social reproduction of the worker, but the systemic reproduction, dash. And this might be a very interesting concept, full stop. It kind of assumes that capitalists might eventually be more interested in maintaining the system, and thus they would grant that certain projects, dash, with regards to, well, certain projects that are accumulation friendly, dash. So we're talking about social impact investments, We're talking about what I basically describe as organic capitalism, Dash. And this, I think, is a connection that is very good to explore, because I was searching for a way to bridge those two worlds, full stop, new paragraph. So on the one hand, there is this organized effort to make everything look organic inside our political system. And second, there is an effort to basically turn the costs of maintaining the system and dealing with the crisis into a revenue stream. Dash. So there is a commodification of the crisis, full stop. And I think this is also one of the biggest concepts that I haven't introduced or can introduce here. It's that as the crisis worsens, the solutions to it get commodified, thus further deepening the crisis in the long term, while even addressing it in the short term, full stop, new paragraph. Then I can argue that this necessity to stave off the crisis is what necessitates this new mode of accumulation based on the crisis itself, full stop. So to some extent, it's solutionism presented in an actually economically and politically literate way, full stop. So that what I actually argue is that the activities of cheapening access to digital services, but also installing AI everywhere and so forth, they make part of a new regime, and that regime has to do with fighting crisis by essentially capitalizing on that process, while making it look as if the outside does not exist, and then the crisis is not really a crisis, full stop, new paragraph. This is where I have to clearly distinguish this idea from the idea of disaster capitalism, full stop, because that would be the natural way to say that, well, these companies are just preying, blah, 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 on, natural disasters and so forth, full stop. No, here I'm arguing that something else is happening, and that something else has to do precisely with this need to, on the one hand, legitimate the system, while at the same time resolving its numerous contradictions through essentially three dimensions. Finance, I used to actually I came up with a very nice framing for it, full stop. So this crisis is resolved in three ways, financialization, urbanization, and digitization, full stop. And this is where I think I have to argue that essentially all of them are presented as somehow being driven by modernity, or they're being driven by increased complexity of society, full stop. But there is also a very different logic at play here, full stop, new paragraph. Essentially, this to me offers a much better explanation of what's happening, full stop. I'm not sure whether I should call this organic capitalism, whether that should be the leading concept, full stop, but I think I can perhaps play with it, but essentially I think this accumulation through crisis, it's not a bad way of putting it. On the other hand, because here it's very positive in a sense. It's not even accumulation through crisis, it's accumulation through problem solving, full stop. So it's almost like accumulation through solutionism, full stop. It's not this original meaning of solutionism where I claim that some of the problems do not exist, full stop. I mean, many of these problems exist. I mean, the ways in which they are framed is, of course, a way that is very friendly to capitalism, full stop, new paragraph. Now, against this background, I have to be able to somehow show what it means for a traditional way of conceiving of capitalism as based on theory of value and exploitation in the workplace and so forth, full stop. And this is where I think I have to think much deeper about whether I would like to present it as some kind of an extension of a long-running critique or a long-running argument about historical capitalism and the ways in which it has traditionally tried to shorten its costs. Or I should instead show that there has always been a neglect inside rather economistic Marxist theory about basically, well, the role of the elites and the way in which elites are actually conspiring to do certain things, but also about the ways in which there are other rationales that relate to militarism, that relate to hegemony, that relate to perpetuation of power and essentially rule, that deserve our analysis, full stop, new paragraph. This is where I might actually argue that this is a new regime of accumulation that revolves around maintaining hegemony, full stop, that even the hegemony of the neoliberal regime now provides a revenue stream and an opportunity for profit, full stop. And this perhaps is what accounts for the durability of this regime, full stop. It's a regime which basically manages to expand even as it fights off its crisis and critics, even if it manages to aggravate the problem in the long term, full stop. But again, this aggravation of the problem means absolutely nothing for the progressive project, in part because there is absolutely no guarantee that that crisis will not result in a disaster that will wipe off that project almost entirely, full stop, new paragraph. So what I think I should argue is that if we conceive of the problem this way, full stop, that essentially all of us, in one way or another, are conscripted into this project of maintaining this regime, that regime is in a much deeper crisis that is essentially invisible due to profound ideological confusion on the one hand through ideas industry and this kind of discourse around finance, technology, and cities, on the other hand, by this exercise of actual, by market power and market instruments and, deployment of financial, urban, and digital technologies to tame the population while essentially increasing the rate of accumulation, if I can show that all of us are conscripted into that regime, even as our overall chances of survival diminish because of climate change, while at the same time our ability to take full advantage of digital technologies to have an even better present that will be more sustainable, that would result in less crapification, that will result in less discrimination, that will actually not deprive us of the ability to think in cause and effects and so forth. If we are concerned about all of that, then the movement opposed to this mode of accumulation should be broad and should not limit itself to just work and labor, full stop, new paragraph. And I think that, what I've done in that essay on Hayek was to start showing the hidden costs of competition, and that there are certain ways in which capitalism, as it operates as a system, keeps suppressing certain modes of knowing itself, full stop. And as those ways of knowing get suppressed, our ability to even identify threats looming on the horizon also diminishes, full stop, new paragraph. Well, what does it mean for labor? Question mark. It's a good question. I think I have to essentially posit that there are certain things about Marxism that need to be retained, full stop. So the kind of use of Marxist writings on competition and the way in which unemployment, for example, in the Reserve Army of Labor, is used to discipline workers, while at the same time, firms behave in certain ways because of certain imperatives and so forth. I think all of that can be preserved, full stop. What I think is less useful is assuming that somehow the only way forward is to continuing to insist on the centrality of the working class to the struggles, full stop. Because right now, I think for tactical reasons, even if not for strategic ones, full stop, it seems insane not to take advantage of the climate disaster, comma. It seems to take advantage as a negative side, full stop. As on the positive side, comma, it seems insane not to take advantage of the new opportunities opened up by information technology, full stop. As those two kind of new themes loom on the horizon, comma, it seems rather insane to continue with the 19th century based argument about work and labor when it's obvious that many of the promises made by this neoliberal regime, comma, with regards to technology or finance or cities, comma, have actually bought off parts of the population that might have otherwise been sympathetic to this project, full stop. So, comma, it is perhaps not very productive to continue beating that drum, and also assuming that somehow we can just go back to the pre-consumer language and start appealing to notions like solidarity as if the last 30 years of destroying it did not happen, full stop. And I think it's wise, comma, for tactical reasons, comma, to start with the people we have and not with the people we would like to have, and it would be very naive to believe that certain ideological sediments have not been planted in the people's hands when it comes to supporting the neoliberal agenda, full stop, new paragraph. So this regimes of accumulation is something I have to explore, full stop. I also think it's very important to show that perhaps the whole overarching push of my argument should not be about reducing costs, full stop. Maybe it should be about saving the system, and that ultimately it's in saving the system that money can be made, full stop. So this is where I can also explain even things that are currently classified as reducing costs under that rubric, full stop. So I can argue that essentially Google and Facebook and others perform a certain function, including allowing us to organize our lives more efficiently and so forth, or access resources for free, or have a relatively inexpensive communication system, comma, and that if that was not there, the cost would skyrocket, the cost of social coordination would skyrocket, and so forth, full stop. So they actually islands of non-commodification in this case, full stop. So we're actually seeing that by commodifying our attention, they have managed to create quite a lot of uncommodified services, which can be tapped for by everybody, and thus dramatically reduce costs and result even in some social innovation, full stop. But one has to understand that, in this case, that social innovation and social coordination comes at the price which is borne by the customer. And that price can be quite heavy in terms of its psychic cost, and it also can be quite heavy in terms of political cost when it comes to manipulating elections, full stop. And I think I have to be able to show that essentially much of what these firms do can be explained by the overall role that they play in helping the system maintain itself, full stop. And this is where I can explain precarious labor on platforms like Uber, full stop. I can explain this kind of consumer paradise of Amazon, full stop. I can explain